Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to our seminar today that is hosted jointly by the Centre for Addictions Research of BC and Island Health. I forget the... Annie, would you... what's the name of the group here that we... Research and Capacity Building. We love collaborating with you using these facilities. So today we have gambling. Last week we had the sex industry, and in January we're going to have substance use and harm reduction in Central Europe. But today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Luke Clark, who is the quite recently appointed director of the new Centre for Gambling Research at the University of British Columbia, set up with an endowment from the government, which is it's a very interesting time because it's an indication of government becoming involved in the business of collecting revenue from gambling, and some would argue a large proportion of that is revenue from problem gambling. So it's important to have research underway to understand the nature of this and to look at what can be done in response to that. So Dr. Clark has been involved in gambling research in the UK at the University of Cambridge and had interesting experiences and finding it much harder to get gambling machines in his laboratory in England than he has here. He's already got gambling machines in his laboratory. Apparently there were questions in the House of Parliament in London about whether or not, the University of Cambridge should be allowed to have access. And one of the attractions of coming to work in a Canadian province to do this kind of work is that government does take a larger role in how the businesses of whether it's alcohol or gambling in this case are run. So Luke, you're very welcome, a warm welcome to British Columbia. Thank you for visiting the island for the first time, and we hope it'll be the first of many visits. Look forward to your talk.
Okay, well thanks Tim, and good morning everyone. Thanks for coming out so close to Christmas. I think this is probably about the latest possible date we could have done this in the run-up, so I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to Tim for inviting me, and Chantel and Amanda and Jen for some of the behind-the-scenes logistics getting me here. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about gambling, and I'll tell you about our work looking at the psychology, also the neuroscience of gambling behaviour. This is very much a two-pronged research program where a lot of our work is looking at the psychological features of gambling games themselves. Are some forms of gambling more risky, potentially more addictive than other gambling games? And our other strand of research is looking at gamblers and problem gamblers, focusing on the individual vulnerabilities, the risk factors, the susceptibilities for gambling addiction. And over time we very much hope that these two strands will converge and we can really start to understand how the games act upon a gambler's cognition. Now, as Tim said, this venture, the Centre for Gambling Research at UBC, came about from some funding to UBC, not to me personally, but funding to UBC from the province of BC and from the BC Lottery Corporation. UBC arranged that funding to keep the academic freedom of the centre from the BCLC and from the wider gambling industry. So the BCLC has no control over our research programme. It doesn't screen in any way our outputs, our publications. But nevertheless, this is a relevant disclosure. It means I need to have this sort of slide at the top of all my talks now. And our objectives at the centre are really twofold. Through understanding the psychology of gambling behaviour, we hope to reduce the harms that are associated with problem gambling. This is very much a clinical objective. This could be improving treatment of problem gambling, could be work on prevention, which is a growing area, for example, at high school in terms of psychoeducation. It could be just in understanding the etiology of problem gambling as an illness. And the second objective is is strengthening the scientific base for gambling policy. So within British Columbia, we have many different strategies that are directed at reducing excessive gambling. We have age restrictions, we have regulation of alcohol availability in venues, we have voluntary self-exclusion. You could come up with 15 or 20 different strategies that are used at a societal level. What's the case at the moment, and this is really the case internationally, is that some of those strategies have some evidence for them, other strategies pretty much no evidence. Some strategies are very expensive to implement at a province level, other strategies less so, and none of this is terribly well joined up. And what we need to see going forward, and what the Centre will contribute to, is that joining up and strengthening that evidence base. And there's also an opportunity here to provide and to become a sort of hub or a focal point for research on gambling across the province and indeed with other provinces. And I very much hope that these collaborations won't be restricted to UBC, and that's one of the reasons that it's great to be here today. So to put this in a bit of context and to tell you a bit about the local context, gambling in BC, and the figures on this slide are taken from the PHO report from 2 years ago, and there's people here who were involved in that report. And that report itself draws mainly upon a prevalence survey done in British Columbia going back a few years now, going back to 2008. And there was a further prevalence survey done in 2012, which is just in the final stages of its write-up, as I understand it, and I'm keen to see how some of the numbers on this slide might have changed over the last couple of years. If we ask about past year, any involvement in gambling in the last 12 months, we see that about 3/4 of those surveyed had some level of gambling involvement. So gambling is a very widespread, ubiquitous activity, and that's true for BC as much as any other jurisdiction. We can look at what are the most popular forms of gambling in that group, and again, a figure that comes through across many different areas is that the state lottery is at the top of that list. Charity raffles, visiting a casino are the other most common forms there. We can start thinking about problem gambling, and I'll tell you a lot more about this on the next couple of slides. But the statistic for the most severe, the actual diagnosis of being a problem gambler, in just under 1% of that sample. But this is known to be now quite a strict diagnosis. And what's clear is that there are a lot of people who maybe don't quite meet that criterion for being a problem gambler. Perhaps they might become a problem gambler further down the road. But if we take a slightly looser definition of moderate risk or at-risk gambling, we're talking about 4 to 5% of the population at this high end of involvement. People experiencing some of the harms of gambling, of course, typically in the form of debt, perhaps family difficulties around their gambling. And we can look in those problem gamblers at what kind of games they play and whether certain forms of gambling might be sort of overrepresented in that group compared to the general population. And that does seem to be the case. And the top games coming through there: internet gambling, machine gambling, which is a very consistent finding across a variety of areas around the world, something that we're very interested in, and poker and sports betting also high on that list. Now, if you're playing devil's advocate, you might say 0.9%. This is still a pretty rare condition, right? Is this really worth all the kind of fuss? But at the same time, another way to think about this is that small group are actually gambling a lot. And so you can start looking in terms of economic calculations, what percentage of revenue, of all the revenue from gambling, might actually come from that small group. And we're talking, this is from the full 4.6% there, estimated that about 1/4 to 1/3 of the revenue from gambling actually comes from that group of problem gamblers, which is quite a powerful statistic, I think. So this is a field where the science has also been evolving quite rapidly in the last couple of years, particularly in the DSM-5, the major guidelines for psychiatry diagnosis. Of course, this is the US guidelines, but it's pretty much embraced worldwide. And in the DSM-5, problem gambling moved house, effectively, into the addictions category. It is the first recognised behavioural addiction. It is the only non-drug addiction in that category. And this was a really major step for the field. It's one that was very much welcomed by gambling researchers. Also in my discussions with gambling clinicians, therapists who work with problem gamblers, this was very much welcomed. And speaking to problem gamblers themselves, in my experience, this is how they think about their illness. So I think this has been a big change for the field. The disorder itself has changed name. It is now called gambling disorder. Throughout my talk, I'll probably continue to use the terms problem gambling and pathological gambling a fair bit. I'm happy to kind of go into some of the semantics there if people are interested. The DSM-5 list for identifying this disorder only changed slightly. One of the 10 symptoms in the DSM-4, criminal behaviour to support gambling, has been dropped in the DSM-5, so that the diagnosis is now made from 4 of these 9 features. And this decision to move it into the addictions category was based upon quite a lot of different lines of evidence. We can think about some of these symptoms are really considered the hallmarks of an addiction syndrome. We can see withdrawal symptoms when problem gamblers stop gambling. We can also see something that looks a lot like tolerance, where over time a gambler plays with larger and larger sums of money. And addictions researchers think about these really as the hallmarks. We see a lot of comorbidity, where problem gamblers seeking treatment have elevated levels of substance use disorders too, particularly nicotine and alcohol. We can see some overlap at a genetic level. If you look, for example, at the identical twins of a problem gambler, the twins are at an elevated risk of problem gambling. They're also at elevated risk of substance problems, particularly alcohol dependence. There's some overlap in effective treatments. Probably the best example here is a drug medication called naltrexone. This is an opiate antagonist. It's been used for several decades to treat heroin and alcohol dependence. It's showing promising signs in a number of clinical trials in treating problem gambling too. And we can also see a lot of overlap in the neuroscience, what I've called here the neuroimaging and the neuropsychological profile, where groups of people with problem gambling have similar profiles to groups with substance dependence. This is probably the largest area of research on this list. The neuroscience was very pivotal in guiding that DSM-5 decision, and I'll give you a few examples of that kind of work as we move through the talk. Now, our work at the centre is also very much guided by this public health framework for thinking about gambling and problem gambling. This is a framework that is applied to other addictions as well, in looking at the interaction between the drug, for example nicotine, as it's delivered through cigarettes, and how that interacts with dispositions at the level of the person. Indeed, this model arose from how viruses work, in the way that a virus, the agent, infects an organism, the host, and you can look at that transmission process as being shaped by the broader environment. That infection might be more likely to occur at higher ambient temperatures than if the weather's very cold, for example. Now, when we start thinking about that as applied to gambling, we have certain risk factors at the level of the gambler, at the level of the individual. So here we might be interested in personality traits like impulsivity. We might be interested in brain chemistry like dopamine, brain structure perhaps. And then at the level of the games themselves, these are the psychological characteristics of the games. We can think about this in terms of classic conditioning. the speed of the game, the size of the rewards, the rate of the rewards, like classic Skinner box studies in psychology. But also in the modern games, we've got some more sophisticated features that we might also want to think about. I'll show you some work in a while looking at gambling near misses. We're interested in gamblers' fallacy type beliefs. This is about streaks of outcomes, for example, a streak of losses or a streak of wins. How does that impact on the player? And also what I've called here illusory control. And this is the ways in which skill, or really the sense of skill, in a game of chance might change a player's view of the game. So choosing your lottery numbers doesn't affect your chances of winning at all, but players like that element of choice. That's an illusory control manipulation. And so this relationship between the game and the gambler, or the player and the product, this is then occurring within the gambling environment as well. What kinds of games exist? What games are legal? What games are widely accessible? Can you access these games on the internet? Can you access them on a cell phone? And so on. And this is where the gambling legislation becomes particularly relevant. So we got into this, as Tim said in the introduction, in work in the UK, where I was working in this field for about best part of 10 years before moving here. In the UK, we only actually have one specialist clinic within our National Health Service that specialises in the treatment of gambling problems, the National Problem Gambling Clinic in central London. This was set up in 2008 by my long-term collaborator Henrietta Bowden-Jones, who continues to direct the clinic. It's been a very successful clinic in terms of its referral rates. The treatment program that they offer is a psychological treatment similar to the BC treatment services, primarily cognitive behavioural therapy, and this is also supplemented with debt counselling and also family therapy, both for quite obvious reasons. And we've been in a very privileged position in Cambridge to work closely with this clinic for a number of years, recruiting some of the gamblers passing through the clinic into research. All of the gamblers who agree to take part in research undergo a core clinical and cognitive assessment, and some of those gamblers also then go into more complex studies involving brain imaging, for example. And we've seen, and this is actually a slide from about a year ago now, we've seen well over 100 severe treatment-seeking pathological gamblers at the clinic. This is the largest study of its kind that's ever been done in the UK. Here they're compared against a group of healthy people, a mixture of people who didn't gamble at all and people who gambled recreationally but at low levels. And there's a few things about this sample that might interest you. They are primarily male, and this applies to the clinic as a whole. All of the clients passing through the clinic, over 90% male. It's interesting to think about why that might be, and perhaps we can come back to that later. It's also the case here that one form of gambling is very common in this group. The preferred form in 40% of this sample is a form of electronic roulette, what in the UK is called a fixed odds betting terminal, FOBT. So these effectively, I suppose they look a bit like slot machines, but you're playing roulette on these terminals. We don't really have much of a casino culture in the UK, so these terminals are in betting shops, which are on the high street in the UK. And as a game, this is a very fast form of roulette. It's much quicker than table roulette, and also compared to a slot machine, which might be in the same venue or in the bar next door, these machines have much higher stakes than our slot machines. And it's those two features, the speed and the stakes, which are suspected to underlie the risks that are emerging as linked to these games. There's a lot of media interest around these games right now in the UK, and I think it's very interesting that this is very much the preferred game in our group of severe problem gamblers. Now, as part of our core assessment, we use this task as a decision-making task, and this starts to map out some of the basic kind of foundations of a player's decision-making, their ability to use probability information, for example, their ability to think about uncertainty. So this is actually called the Cambridge Gamble task. I don't really think of it too much as a gambling task. This is more of a neurological probe of decision-making. Those of you with backgrounds in psychology will have heard of the Iowa gambling task by Damasio. It's very much in that line of thinking. So the participant sees a row of boxes along the top of the screen. They're told that one token has been hidden in these boxes. They have to guess if it's in a red box or a blue box. Players usually choose the colour that's in the majority, so they would pick blue here. And we then ask them to stake some points. This is not real money, these are hypothetical points on that colour decision. And that bet is presented either in a sequence where it gets higher over time or it drops down over time. And if their decision's correct, they win the amount bet, and if they're wrong, they lose the amount bet. And on this task, in our large group, so there's about 90 male pathological gamblers in these data, we can see a number of difficulties in players' basic decision making. They are less likely here to choose whichever colour is in the majority, and that is particularly the case on the more uncertain trials. So this data point here on a 6-4 trial, on this case here where you've got 6 blue boxes and 4 red, the problem gambler is more likely than the healthy control to choose red. They choose the unlikely colour there. So this effectively is an irrational decision. They also tend to place higher bets on those decisions, even though they're effectively choosing in the wrong direction. They place higher bets across the board, but also they particularly place higher bets when the bet starts very high and they have to control themselves and wait for the bet to reach a more appropriate level. Now, I suppose you might look at this and think, well, of course they're betting high, they're a problem gambler, this is sort of what they do. We've actually seen the same profile as that a couple of years ago in a group of outpatients with alcohol dependence who had no real interest in gambling. And this marker, and there are a number of other studies with different tasks that back up this conclusion, there seems to be impulsive decision making is a cognitive marker that seems to cut across the addictions, and we suspect that it's actually related to the risk, that it predates the addiction and it's a risk factor for that addiction. And there's other work in high risk groups that's starting to support that hypothesis. We could also start to look at the neuroscience of this disorder, and probably one of the first things that springs to mind is dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is targeted either directly or indirectly by all drugs of abuse. And we know from this work, famous work by Nora Volkov's group, using PET imaging, that dopamine receptor levels are reduced in the brain of patients with different forms of drug addiction. So in these studies with PET, a dopamine medication, a drug called raclopride, is radioactively labeled, injected into the participant in very tiny doses. That drug gets taken up into the brain, binds to the dopamine receptors, and in the PET camera we can then visualize that signal as a marker of their dopamine receptor levels. This is the only method that we have for measuring dopamine in the living human brain. And as you can see, the dopamine levels are, that signal is weaker in the drug users on the right-hand side compared to the healthy control participants on the left-hand side. There is also a direct link from dopamine to gambling coming from this fascinating syndrome in Parkinson's disease. So in Parkinson's disease, the dopamine system is degenerating, The main treatments for Parkinson's aim to replenish the dopamine system, but with certain medications we can see a side effect of spontaneous problem gambling. It's very much linked to the medications. If the patient stops taking that medication, the gambling goes away again. They can go back on the medication and it comes back. It's very clearly linked to the dopamine medication. So we started using this PET technique with the raclopride procedure in the pathological gamblers attending the London clinic. This is work done at the Hammersmith Hospital in London with Anne Lingford-Hughes and Dave Nutt. We had a very clear prediction. We expected to see this same reduction that you can see in this slide in the drug addiction. We expected to see this in pathological gamblers, and we were unable to see any indication of this decrease. These are the dopamine levels in the striatum, this subcortical collection of nuclei in the center of the brain, the main dopamine hub, and there are no group differences between the male pathological gamblers and male controls here. We do see some individual differences in the gamblers, and these are particularly related to their impulsivity levels. This is a questionnaire measure. Is one particular component of impulsivity called urgency. This is mood-related impulsivity, doing impulsive things either when you're in a low mood, for example, a depressed or anxious state, or positive urgency, doing impulsive things when you're feeling very high, very euphoric. The problem gamblers as a group score very, very highly on that trait. We've seen that in a number of studies now. And those gamblers with the highest levels of that trait do show that reduction in dopamine receptor levels that is a group effect in drug addiction. So it's not a group effect in pathological gambling, but there's a more complex triad where dopamine, this addictive disorder, and impulsivity seem to be joined up in a more complex picture. Now, in taking this work forward, we've changed our focus from looking at dopamine to looking at a related neurotransmitter, looking at the opioid system. So I'm sure you've all heard of the endogenous opioids, like endorphin, released during exercise, for example, very much linked to the runner's high. This system is involved in euphoria. It also has an important role in analgesia as well. And that drug naltrexone, which is showing promising signs in treating pathological gambling, blocks this system. But we have no other data at the moment on the integrity of that system in problem gambling. So in this PET study, which has just been completed, again at the Hammersmith Hospital, Anne Lingford-Hughes and Dave Nutt's group, and Lisa Mick was the lead researcher on this study. We've used a different PET procedure. This is the ligand carfentanil, which binds to the opioid receptors. And each participant here has 2 scans, either side of receiving a low dose of amphetamine. And amphetamine drives release of the endogenous opioids, and those opioids then knock off the PET ligand from the opioid receptors. And so following the amphetamine, you can see in one participant here that let me just bring my cursor up. The binding in these regions is reduced after amphetamine. That's a measure of opioid release. So in this study, again, we see no differences at baseline in opioid binding between problem gamblers and controls, but we do see that the problem gamblers show blunted opioid release across several brain regions, including the striatum and also parts of the prefrontal cortex. So we're seeing weaker opioid release in the gamblers. And they also show less euphoria as a subjective mood response to the amphetamine challenge as well. So this backs up the conclusion that there might not be changes in baseline levels, but it's really in the reactivity of the system, the response of that system when it's challenged, that might be the marker in problem gambling. And there are similar studies to this in drug addiction as well. Now, PET is actually a very expensive procedure within psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Much more of the neuroimaging work happens using functional MRI. This is the kind of scanner that would be used in these studies. The participant lies on this bed and they get slid into the magnet, and they're then playing different cognitive tasks using a button box or a joystick that rests on their stomach. And we're measuring oxygenation levels from the blood as they do this task. And really the breakthrough study in the gambling field, coming up for a decade ago now, is a German paper by Martin Reuter and Christian Buchel's group. And this is using this kind of task that you can see here. It's a card guessing game. There are two cards face down on the screen. The player has to choose either the left or the right card to turn over. If they turn it over and it's a black card, they won €1 in this study. If it's a red card, hearts or diamonds, they lose €1. And the wins and losses are actually rigged so that all the players gradually build up a profit over the course of their brain scan. And we can then compare the brain activity after the wins compared to the brain activity after the losses. And in the controls, the healthy people, we can see a nice strong response coming again from the striatum, this dopamine and opioid hub, and also the prefrontal cortex. And that reward-related activity is reduced, again it's blunted in the problem gamblers compared to the controls, and the level of that blunting is also related to how severe their problem is. So if they have a very severe gambling disorder, there's an even greater degree of blunting. So this is very consistent with what we're seeing in the opioid PET study, but it's the reactivity of this system that seems to be the important marker. But when this study came out in 2005, and this was really one of the key papers that inspired our first work, I looked at this task, and this to me seemed a very simple, almost a kind of trivial procedure for getting at the decision making in someone with a gambling problem. We see a lot of thinking going on in these tasks, we see a lot of decision making, and this left or right guess is really just seemed to me pretty much an arbitrary decision. And I wanted to develop some slightly more realistic tasks that would more engage the decision making and the thinking and the excitement of gambling games. And we came up with a task that's really a stripped down slot machine. It has two reels, and actually on the left hand reel one of these symbols gets chosen on each spin. So here we've chosen this anchor, and then the other, the right hand reel, spins for a few seconds and comes to stop on one of the symbols. And if the two reels line up, so if it had landed on the anchor, you'd have won £1 in our study in England. And if the two reels misalign, you don't win anything. But we can then separate out the near misses if the anchor landed immediately either side of that pay line from the full misses if the anchor had landed in one of the far away positions. And we take some ratings as people go through this task. How pleased were you with that outcome? After they get a near miss, they don't like the near misses. They are more unpleasant, in fact, than the outright misses. These two outcomes, objectively, they're the same. The near misses and the full misses are equivalent. You haven't won anything. If you had a wager on the table, you'd have lost it. But people find the near misses aversive. But a few seconds later, how much do you want to continue playing this game right now? They report a higher level of motivation after the near misses. The near misses encourage them to continue. We took that task into the brain scanner. We're interested in how these reward areas might respond to near misses. We can identify those reward areas, firstly, looking at the response to the jackpot wins. And again, this is the same areas that I've shown you before, the striatum, also this area out on the side of the brain. So this is a slice cutting through the brain this way. This area out at the side of the brain is called the insula. And we then look within those areas that respond to wins at whether those areas respond to the near misses more than the full misses. Yes, they do. We see a significant win-related activity in response to near miss outcomes when no actual reinforcement has been delivered. Again, that's in the striatum and the insula. This insular response looks quite small, but the insular response is particularly interesting because it scales with some differences between people. Players who have a stronger insular response to near misses show a stronger motivational effect of the near misses as well. And also players with a stronger insular response to near misses tend to score higher on a questionnaire measure looking at their susceptibility to different gambling distortions. So this is consistent with this more cognitive approach to gambling, which really emphasizes the decision making and the biases and distortions that players experience when they're in the game. Often when a problem gambler is sat in their clinic, Tim and I were talking about this earlier, in the clinic or maybe in their home, they are very aware of how the game is structured. They can explain the idea of house edge or that the house always wins. But when they enter the casino or where they enter the slot machine, they seem to flip into this different state where these distortions create an expectancy. They believe that they're about to win. And we think this is why they're playing. Now, a lot of these distortions exist in decision making, and they exist in everyone. Any of you who have seen Dan Kahneman's bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, he describes many different decision making biases that everybody suffers from. But there's increasing evidence that problem gamblers seem to be more susceptible to at least some of these distortions. And the two main kinds of distortions that apply to gambling are the illusion of control, this confusion between a skill situation and a chance situation, and what's called the gambler's fallacy, how we think about repeated but random events. So if you're flipping a coin and you've seen the last 5 tosses have all landed on heads, most people think at that point that they must be they must be somehow due a tail to balance out what looks like a strange sequence. And these are a lot of the different effects that have been described in gambling sort of boil down to these two basic types. Now, in following up our imaging work, we were particularly interested in that insular region, and that was where we'd seen a strong brain response to near misses and where that response scaled with some markers of gambling involvement. And we had an opportunity to follow this finding up in quite an unusual design where we've been able to test neurological patients with acquired brain injury, patients who have either experienced strokes or brain tumours in very specific parts of the brain where these are quite small lesions, and the lesions are very well characterised with MRI. And this is a project with Antoine Bashara in the University of Iowa patient registry, which is one of the largest patient databases of this kind anywhere in the world. And we were able to test a number of patients with damage to part of the prefrontal cortex. And this is famously the area that we think was damaged in Phineas Gage. We've also got a small group with damage to the insula, that area where we see the response to near misses. We've got a group of patients with damage to the amygdala, another key emotional hub. And we've got some healthy controls and also some neurological controls with damage elsewhere in the brain, mainly at the back of the brain. And this wasn't a scanning study. We gave the slot machine task behaviourally, and we took these ratings after each trial. How pleased are you with that outcome, and how much do you want to continue after the different kinds of outcomes, the wins, the near misses, and the full misses. And what I'm showing you here is that motivational response to near misses compared to full misses. So this is a change score. And you can see in the healthy controls a positive score here indicates that they have a stronger motivation after near misses than full misses. We've seen this effect many times in the lab. We get the same effect in the amygdala patients, and the effect's only slightly blunted in the prefrontal patients. But this effect is completely abolished in the patients with damage to the insula. They do not show a motivational response to those near-miss outcomes. If anything, they have reduced motivation after near misses compared to full misses. And in this experiment, we also gave them a second psychological task to try to measure the gambler's fallacy. And this was a task that was basically a roulette game. You're betting red or blue in this study on successive spins of a roulette wheel. So imagine you've been watching the wheel and you've seen the last 4 spins have all landed on red, 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 red. The gambler's fallacy at this point is to think that blue is going to happen next, so you would choose blue. And we can see that in the data here. This is the chance of you choosing either colour, let's say red, if the last outcome was red, if the last 2 outcomes were red, if the last 3, 4, here the last 5 successive outcomes have all been red. So this downward slope that you can see across this graph, this is the gambler's fallacy. You are less likely to choose red after a run of preceding reds. And we can see that effect clearly in 3 of the groups in this study. That effect, once again, is abolished in the patients who have had damage to their insular cortex. These patients do not show 2 classic gambling biases, the near-miss effect and the gambler's fallacy. So this study really has brought our focus upon the insula as a core component in this brain system. What do we know the insula does? The insula has a key role in what is called interoception. This is detecting and perceiving what is going on in your body. So visceral sensation, excitement. And we know, of course, that gambling is a very exciting, a very visceral activity. It's been shown going back to the 80s now that as people gamble, we see massive increases in heart rate. We see release of cortisol, a stress hormone. We can see sweating in the fingertips as people play our slot machine task. This is again in students, not the brain injury study. We see this sweating response when players get the jackpot wins, but also we see a significant skin conductance response to the near misses as well. And it's possible that in the patients with insular damage, they might be less able to detect these subtle signals that are coming from the body. And if this is true, it generates an important clinical prediction. If damage to the insula wipes out these distortions, we think that these distortions are increased in people with problem gambling. We would expect to see overactivity, over-recruitment of the insula in problem gamblers. And in a grant that we're finishing with the patients from the London Clinic at the moment, we're testing that prediction using functional MRI. If that is true, that paves the way for some potentially novel treatments trying to tone down the volume on that insular signal. You could do that using biofeedback. You could do that using meditation-type techniques, mindfulness-based training, and that has been shown in some other branches of clinical psychology for other forms of mental illness. Now, just for the last 2 minutes, I want to move back to the real games. I've shown you some of our work where we've used programmed, simplified gambling tasks, what we call gambling simulations that run on a laptop. But these games are still much stripped down compared to real play. And if you went to the casino today, this is the kind of game that you might end up playing. This is a modern multi-line slot machine. You can see it's a very kind of garish display here, but also you've got 5 reels on this game. You can see several of the lines here. And on these modern games, you don't just bet or win on this central pay line. These multi-line games, you could win for several different line combinations, maybe 15 or 20 different combinations, so that you've actually got a win just here for this funny L-shaped clam arrangement. That's one of the wins on this multi-line game. Only to bet on all of those lines, you had to place quite a high wager to start that trial, so that you've bet 75 cents on that, and you've only actually won 25 cents for this funny clamshell arrangement. So technically, it's a net loss, right? You're actually 50 cents down, but if you completely lose on these games, the machine is just silent. But for one of these lines coming up, you get the bells and the whistles of a win. And this effect has been called the loss disguised as a win. It's a net loss, but it triggers the sensory impact, the sounds and the sights, the visuals of a win. And I should say this effect has only been described in the last couple of years. The first paper describing this effect in 2010. All of the papers on this effect are from Mike Dixon, Kevin Harrigan's group at the University of Waterloo. And I think that in a way highlights what a young area of research this is. And the Waterloo group have established now a number of important features that are linked to these losses disguised as wins. Like our studies on near misses, the losses disguised as wins also generate physiological arousal in the body. Heart rate, skin conductance responses that look like the responses to real wins. If you ask them straight afterwards, how often did you really win there? How often did the payout actually exceed what you bet? We can see that the LDWs distort those memories. They overestimate. They have an interesting effect on the losing streaks. If you were playing an old-fashioned single-line game, you barely ever go for more than 20... on a single-line game, you could go for 20 or 30 successive spins without any reward happening. But if you treat these losses disguised as wins as if they were wins, you'll barely ever go for more than 5 or 6 spins without something happening, without some form of reinforcement coming through. So players, in a way, it might kind of smooth their psychological experience of the game. And in their most recent paper, they've seen that problem gamblers seem to be more sensitive to these effects. They prefer the multi-line games, and they describe them as creating a higher level of immersion and being more skillful than the single-line games. So we can see from the Waterloo work that the LDWs do seem to create an inaccurate perception of how profitable these games are, and we're starting to see that problem gamblers seem to be more sensitive to these effects. So the final slide here, rather than a conclusion slide, I want to tell you where we're taking this research in the Centre for Gambling Research, our sort of short-term agenda. One of the advantages from working with the BCLC as a stakeholder in the centre is that we already have a number of these modern slot machines that we have situated in our lab. So this gives us that realism of the real games, but we have that control over the environment where we know the state that the players are in when they enter the lab. We can control what's happening around them. We can record exactly what's happening on the games while they play them, whether they get the jackpots, whether they get the bonus features, and we can measure these physiological responses while they play. You couldn't do many of those things in a real casino, but we can do them in the casino lab. And one of the first things we're interested in really is that state of immersion, this absorption in the game where players lose sense of time, they lose sense of what's going on around them, they're completely immersed, what's been called the machine zone. Very difficult thing to capture. You know, if you just tap someone on the shoulder when they're in that zone, say, are you in the zone right now? You distract them out of it. So we're trying to capture that state in the lab and look at its relationship with arousal. As well as some projects in problem gamblers, we're not going to have the problem gamblers playing the real machines, but we'll do some work looking at the basics of decision making, the basic foundations. But I'm also very much interested in the transition into problem gambling. What happens as a a regular gambler, a recreational gambler, what happens is they start to lose control over their gambling. How does that transition occur? This needs a different kind of research design. We want to get away from just comparing the severe group against people who don't gamble at all, and rather we need to chart players over time. Get players earlier on in that trajectory. Some players will realize that they're developing a problem and be able to rein it in effectively. Other players will escalate into a full problem status. That takes a different research approach. And finally, I'm still fascinated by exactly what behavioral addiction is. Problem gambling is the first recognized behavioral addiction. How do we get addicted to behaviors if there's no drugs going into the system? What else might join it in that DSM-5 category? And one of the major conditions that's been discussed is internet gaming disorder, excessive online video game play. And we can think about the features of video games in much the same way as the features of gambling games. Near misses, reinforcement rates, the sense of skill in the game. I'm going to stop there. I need to thank a lot of people. The lab in Vancouver, it's just me and 3 grad students at the moment. We're starting small and hopefully growing over time. Still a number of people pursuing this work in Cambridge, and we work closely with the National Problem Gambling Clinic in London and the Hammersmith, also Antoine Bashara at USC. There's lots of publications and things on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter. And yeah, thanks very much for your time.